Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament Gospels, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we're looking at the religious leaders questioning Jesus about the greatest commandments. And we've seen this back and forth over the last about this whole week that we've been studying. They're trying to trick Jesus, they're trying to trap Jesus. They keep continuing to try to do this, and Jesus keeps obviously, or calling them out, or either answering their question or responding with a question that stumps them even more. And so they keep trying to do this, and the point is they're trying to trap Jesus in something to where they have an excuse to either arrest him. I mean, eventually they want to kill him. That's what their ultimate goal is. But this is what we see here. And so in Matthew 22:34 through 40, and it's in Mark 12 as well, the religious leaders come to this. Now, if you remember yesterday, the Sadducees asked them about the resurrection of the dead because they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And so he was able to answer that and prove that there is, because, the God, they said God's the God of Jacob, Moses, Abraham, and he couldn't be the God of people who are dead. And so as we look at this, you know, they kind of huddle back up, and then they're going to try to trap him again. So I'm going to read from Matthew 22 verses 34 through 40, and we'll look at the notes on this. It says in 34, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in the religious law, tried to trap him with this question, and this could easily have been a trick question if they actually didn't understand it. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important, and this is, some versions don't say, some versions will say, and this is why I like the New Living Translation, some versions will say a second like it, right? And we have to understand that these two are, you can't disconnect these two. They're just as important. They're equally important. And so, we can't say, oh well, this one's the greatest, and this one's the second greatest. They're really both the greatest commands. And so that's what we need to make sure we understand about this. They're tied together. You can't separate them. They're two commands that are tied together. It says the second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. So he again, he stunned them again, because they thought for sure that he was going to say like some command, like one of the 10 commandments, something like that, and they'd be like, well, what about this one, or what about this one, and try to trap him. And he gives them two commands. They can't argue with that. They can't be argued with it. And so as we look in the notes on this, you would think the Pharisees, right, you would think that they would be glad that the Sadducees were finally silenced, right? Jesus had a victory over them, over something that they've been debating for hundreds of years. And the Sadducees tried to trap him, but the Pharisees, right, they were too proud to be impressed by this, because they could not see past their own pride. They could not see past their own. And I've seen people that they're just this. They get like this. They get into theology, and they have these thoughts and this stuff, and most of it's traditions, right? And it's like, no, this is the way it has to be, and it can't be any other way. And they'll grab like one verse, and they'll stick to that verse, and it's like, no, and ignore like the 30 other verses that say something very different, or something that says, or something that even Jesus says very differently. And they'll just hold on to it, and they'll just get stuck down in their tradition and their stuff like that, and they just won't budge out of it no matter what. I mean, you could show them clear as day, and they're just going to grab onto that, and they're not going to let go. And that's what the Pharisees and the Sadducees and them were doing. And so they were just more interested in defeating Jesus. They were more interested in defeating Jesus than learning the truth. And we see Christians today, they're more interested in making sure that what they think is right, and they're not open to learning the truth. I used to be there. I used to be there. I used to have a lot of these ideas that I've learned, a lot of them are traditions, right? A lot of them are things that's just been done the last 150 years. And then it's like we've made them biblical, and we've made them, you know, like our theological stances, when they're not. Right. And I used to be there. And the more I studied, the more I learned, the more I looked outside of the bubble. You're right. We get stuck in bubbles sometimes, and we don't want to look outside our bubbles and open ourselves to other things and other thoughts. But we need to. We need to look outside of what like just the things we've been taught, and be accepting of, or open to learning new things. Now, there's a lot of things I've studied I don't believe in, and I still don't believe in it, and I probably won't ever believe in it. But there's a lot that I have learned because I've been willing to open myself up, and that's what the Pharisees refused to do. They refused to look outside their strict, narrow view, and refuse to look outside of it at all. And so we need to make sure we don't get trapped in this. So the Pharisees at this point, had classified over 600 laws that were to be followed, and it was ridiculous. And they would try to distinguish which one was the more important from the less important laws, and they would flaunt themselves and be like, oh, look at the laws that I'm keeping, look at all these laws that I'm keeping and doing, and look at me, look how awesome I am because I do this, and this. And we get caught up in that in Christianity today. We think, oh, well, because I went and did this, or I never missed church, so look at how awesome I am. And it's like, okay, you never missed church, but you're the rudest, meanest person I've ever met in my life. What does that say? And so, or you're mean, or you're hateful, or you gossip all the time. And it's like, wait a minute, something's not lining up here. And so, just because you can obey a bunch of rules doesn't make you a Christian. And in this day, just because they could follow a bunch of rules didn't make them good follower of God. And I mean, we see the opposite. They were so obsessed with their traditional laws that they murdered Christ. And so that's what we're looking at. And we see that today. We see that a lot today in the church. We get so obsessed with the things that we do, the church traditions that we've done for so long, that we've made scripture, that we actually ignored what Jesus has actually called us to do. And so we got to be very careful of that. And so one of them, who was the expert in the religious law, asked Jesus to identify the most important law. And so not only did he respond with the most important, but he gave him two. And like I said, I like the way the New Living Translation says this, because it's one and the same. You can't have one without the other, right? You can't love God without loving your neighbor, all right? And if you're going to love your neighbor, you're loving God. And so the two are intertwined. And in this, it goes to what I call the vertical and the horizontal, right? And we spend too much time, not to say that it's not important, right? But we spend too much time focused on the horizontal. I'm sorry, the vertical. We spend too much time on the vertical. And people are like, well, Chad, you can't say that. You can't say we spend too much time. Yeah, we do. We focus on this all the time, thinking we have to make this, like those of us who are Christians, let me put it this way, because we think we have to always make this vertical thing right. Right? Yeah, we're to love God. We're to love God, and we're to show the love to God. How do we show our love to God? By the horizontal. We show our love to God by how we treat people, right? And so that's it. It's like loving God, but you can't. If you're going to love God, then you're going to love the people. And it goes back to this whole idea that I did a lesson on this one time. It's like, okay, me as a father, how does someone show to me that they care for me, right? It's how you treat my daughter, right? If you treat my daughter horribly, then that means to me that you have no love or appreciation for who I am. And it's the same thing with God, right? If we truly love God and we worship God like we say we do, then we're gonna have a love for those people around us. That we're gonna love our neighbor, right, as ourselves. But too often, we see, well, we love God, we love the people who are like us, we like other Christians, but we're going to be mean and hateful to the rest of the world. And that's not what we're called to do. Right? The parable of the Good Samaritan points that out, right? When we talk about who the good neighbor, or who's, we're talking about being a good neighbor. And so those are the kind of things that we have to get to focus on, right? Because if you focus on the horizontal, the vertical will be taken care of. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't spend time with God, that we don't pray, we don't spend time in His Word, we don't worship Him. And we're called to do all those things. But too often we get so tied up in, well, I've got to worship, I've got to pray, I've got to read the Bible, I've got to do these things, that we forget it with the rest. It's like, oh, well, we know this, and we know this, and we know this, but we seem to have forgotten what this looks like. And so that's why I'm kind of harping on this a little bit, because I think we've lost that view, right? Our focus, we spend so much time trying to look up and say, God, are you impressed with me? Are you impressed with me? Or thank you, and then we go out in the world and we're mean and we're hateful and we're rude. And again, I'm not calling us to be perfect, but I'm saying we're to be the reflection of Christ in the world, and in many ways, the church is not that way anymore. And so we need to work on that, and I think we need to pay attention to these verses. And so Jesus basically says, look, these two verses sum up all the Ten Commandments. Because if you love me, you're going to follow the Ten Commandments. If you and all the Old Testament moral laws, right? And if you truly love God, you're going to love your neighbor. So we naturally can keep all those commandments. And so the one thing that's I like about this is God is looking at the law positive, right? Too often, God's saying, do these things, right? Jesus is saying, this is what you need to do. And in fact, if you look at most of his commands, his rules, his laws, however you want to say it, these are things you should do, right? We spend all our time going around telling everyone what they shouldn't do. We spend way too much time telling people, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this. We're known for what we're against, and we're not known for what we're for. We should be for loving people, right? We need to go around and tell you, loving people, right? That's the basics of Christianity. That's 101. Jesus gives it to us here. And so instead of spending all of our time going out telling people what we're against, we need to be going out and telling people what we're for. Because if you go out and you show the positive message of Christianity and what it is, and then instead of attacking everything that we don't like, then you show people the true version of Christianity. And so the one thing we have to remember here is, God's laws are not burdensome. And the Pharisees, religious leaders, had made the rules and burdensome, right? We call ourselves simply church, and because what God calls us to is simple, right? And when we say that, right, it's a simple message. It's simply being the church, and that those simply being the church is those two things. Now we always counter that with, yes, it's Christianity. It is the call to become a Christian is simple, right? Being a Christian is simple. It's not easy, and there's a difference. And so Jesus simplified this. He simplified everything. He took the 600 rules and he brought it into one, and he simplified it. And so, all of this can be simplified into two principles. The whole gospel, everything, the whole Old and New Testament together can be simplified into two things: loving God and loving others. And if you do those two things, everything else is going to play out. And that's the wonderful part about it. And so, this is what Jesus said. All of these two things summarize the law. And so, and that's what these two things should rule our thoughts, decisions, and actions. If we do that, if we let these things run through, we filter everything through these two laws, then we're golden. I mean, it's not that hard. It's really not that hard. I mean, again, I try to say, we try to simplify it. We try to simplify Christianity because, again, it's simple, but it's not easy. And so in the end, when you're uncertain about what you do, ask yourself, which course of action best demonstrates the love for God or love for others? It's like, if you don't know what to do, what shows the love for God, what shows my love for others, and filter it through that. And so, again, in this whole thing, and I've, hit on it a lot, Jesus basically is somewhere. Again, they try to trick him. They're not going to be able to trick him. And he's probably stunned a lot of them with this. And if you want to know the two laws that he actually pulled from there, the first one is Deuteronomy 6:5, and the second one is Leviticus 19:18. Those are the two laws, the two commandments he's talking about. And so in the end, right, if you're struggling with Christianity, it's like, man, all these rules, all these laws are hard, then you're not doing it right. And I'm just going to say you're not doing it right, because if you're trying to be a Christian and win your Christianity and stay safe by doing all the right things, or not, like focusing on what you're not supposed to do and that kind of stuff, then you're making it more complicated than it is, right? True Christianity is loving God and loving your neighbor. And if you filter your actions, filter the things that you're struggling with through those things, then it gets really simple and it gets really easy. Or I'm sorry, it gets simple. It gets easier than what you've made it and then what we've made it. But it's still, in the end, it's still hard because we're going counter to our human nature. I hope this helps. I hope this is one of my favorite verses, because I love how it takes everything that we've even complicated today and made all these things today, and it brings it down into a simple understanding. But look, these are the two things we need to focus on as Christians, and that's it. Those are the two things. As always, I appreciate everyone for watching, following through, staying through these. This is day 201, I think, that we're on here. So we're getting close to the end. I think it's going to be a little bit more than 250 days for the whole thing. But again, I appreciate everyone who's been staying with us through this entire series. I hope it's been helpful. If it has, please share it. It's in an entire playlist on YouTube, so people can actually go back through and watch it if they want to. But again, I appreciate everyone for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so, because we are going to continue to put together different series. We're going to, in our next sessions, we're going to get away from doing like a daily Devo type thing, looking, verse by verse through the scripture. And we're going to start doing more theme based or more situational type stuff that we see every day people struggling with in their lives. And we're going to hope we can speak into that a little bit and help with that. So as always, I appreciate everyone for watching. Have a nice day.